Gershom G. Scholem's Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, General Characteristics of Jewish Mysticism. It is not necessary for me to say anything further at this point about the reasons which have often transformed mystics into heretics. Well, heresy is just authentically having opinions, It's not really quite what people make it out to be. Such heresy does not always have to be fought with fire and sword by the religious community. It may even happen that its heretical nature is not understood and recognized. Particularly is this the case where the mystic succeeds in adapting himself to the orthodox vocabulary and uses it as a wing or vehicle for his thoughts. And one of now, Wahhabi is a term used as hate speech, but the Muwahhideen are almost indistinguishable from certain Sufi orders. Yeah, they're supposed to be, and it's also not the same thing as the Saudi state. The Unitarians are not the same thing as the Saudi government, which is secularized. But as a matter of fact, this is what many Kabbalists have done, while Christianity and Islam, which had at their disposal more extensive means of repression and the apparatus of the state, have frequently and drastically suppressed the more extreme forms of mystical movements. Few analogous events are to be found in the history of Judaism. Nevertheless, in the lectures of Septarianism and Hasidism, we shall have occasion to note that instances of this kind are not entirely lacking. And one of the things that we can state about that is that when it comes to Judaism, you very explicitly have persecution of all polytheists, destructions of their houses of worship, and all this other stuff. Christians focus on the monotheists and the non-Christian polytheists. And this is built into their main books of scripture, the books that we call the Bible. Islam doesn't allow this in its main books. And you find that the secular current, as it's creeped into states like Saudi Arabia and other places like this is where a lot of the oppression derives from. It's like, what are they banning? They're banning interpretation books, certainly, certain books of poetry, but they're focusing on the religion stuff to ban. They're not focusing on the irreligious stuff to ban and kick out. They're focusing on the religious stuff to ban. And the so-called blasphemy laws are focused on criticism of the state. It's not criticism of religion as much as that they're going after. And a lot of this stuff, not too. It's like, do they kill apostates? Name one Muslim majority country that allows that for killing apostates. But they kill apostates for rape and murder and, stuff that people shouldn't ever do with pre-adolescents and that sort of stuff. Maybe kidnapping or treason or something, but you got to differentiate between what's done by a group of people said to be of a faith and what's actually upheld by the faith, Part 4 of this lecture, we have seen that mystical religion seeks to transform the God whom it encounters in the particular religious consciousness of its own social environment from an object of dogmatic knowledge into a novel and living experience and intuition. In addition, it also seeks to interpret this experience in a new way. Its practical side, the realization of God, and the doctrine of the quest for God are therefore frequently, particularly in the more developed forms of the mystical consciousness, connected with a certain ideology. This ideology, this theory of mysticism, is a theory both of the mystical cognition of God and his revelation, and of the path which leads to him. It should now be clear why the outward forms of mystical religion within the orbit of a given religion are to a large extent shaped by that positive content and values recognized and glorified in that religion. We cannot, therefore, expect the physiognomy of Jewish mysticism to be the same as that of Catholic mysticism and of Baptism or Muslim Sufism. The particular aspects of Christian mysticism which are connected with the person of the Savior and mediator between God and man. The mystical interpretation of the Passion of Christ, which is repeated in the personal experience of the individual, all this is foreign to Judaism and also to its mystics. Their ideas proceed from the concepts and values peculiar to Judaism, that is to say, above all, from the belief in the unity of God, and the meaning of his revelation is laid down in the Torah, the sacred law. And as we see in the writings talked about Paul, they always talk about dark sayings and, it's not literally prophesying this. It's not literally saying that a Christ or Messiah is this, but this is what it really means, that sort of thing. And so they give it a Mithraic and other mystery school sort of interpretation, and then deny the mystery school aspect of it and crystallize the concept of it. I mean, they make it very prosaic in what it's supposed to mean and how it's supposed to be applied. Jewish mysticism in its various forms, the Christians do that. Jewish mysticism in its various forms represents an attempt to interpret the religious values of Judaism in terms of mystical values. It concentrates upon the idea of the living God who manifests himself in the acts of creation, revelation, and redemption. Pushed to its extreme, the mystical meditation on this idea gives birth to the conception of a sphere, a whole realm of divinity, which underlies the world of our sense data and which is present and active in all that exists. This is the meaning of what the Kabbalists call the world of the Sephirot. Yeah, I should like to explain this a little more fully. The attributes of the living God are conceived differently and undergo a peculiar transformation when compared with the meaning given to them by the philosophers of Judaism. Among the latter, Maimonides, in his Guide to the Perplexed, felt bound to ask, how is it possible to say of God that he is living? Does that not imply a limitation of the infinite being? The words God is living, he argues, can mean that he is not dead. That is to say, that he is the opposite of all that is negative. He is the negation of negation. A quite different reply is given by the Kabbalists, for whom the distinction, nay, the conflict between the known and the unknown God, has significance denied to it by the philosophers of Judaism. No creature can take aim at the unknown, the hidden God. In the last resort, every cognition of God is based on a form of relation between him and his creature, i.e., on manifestation of God in something else and not on a relation between him and himself. It has been argued that the difference between the Deus absconditus, God in himself, and God in his appearance is unknown to Kabbalism. This seems to me a wrong interpretation of the facts. On the contrary, the dualism embedded in these two aspects of the one God, both of which are, theologically speaking, possible ways of aiming at the divinity, has deeply preoccupied the Jewish mystics. It has occasionally led them to use formulas whose implied challenge to the religious consciousness of monotheism was fully revealed only in the subsequent development of Kabbalism. As a rule, the Kabbalists were concerned to find a formula which should give as little offense as possible to the philosophers. For this reason, the inherent contradiction between the two aspects of God is not always brought out as clear as in the famous doctrine of an anonymous writer around 1300, according to whom God, in himself, as an absolute being, and therefore by his very nature incapable of becoming the subject of a revelation to others, is not and cannot be meant in the documents of revelation, in the canonical writings of the Bible, and in the rabbinical tradition. He is not the same. He's not the subject of these writings, and therefore also has no documented name, since every word of the sacred writings refers, after all, to some aspect of his manifestation on the side of creation. It follows that while the living God, the God of religion, of whom these writings bear witness, has innumerable names, which, according to the Kabbalist, belong to him by his very nature, and not as a result of human convention. The Deus the Deus absconditus, which can also be pronounced Deus absconditus, the God who is hidden in his own self, can only be named in a metaphorical sense, and with the help of words which, mystically speaking, are not real names at all. The favorite formula of the early Spanish Kabbalists are speculative paraphrases like root of all roots, great reality, indifferent unity, and above all, Ein Sof. The later designation reveals the impersonal character of this aspect of the hidden God from the standpoint of man, as clearly as, and perhaps even more clearly than, the others. It signifies the infinite as such, not, as has been frequently suggested, he who is infinite, but that which is infinite. Isaac the Blind, one of the first Kabbalists of distinguishable personality, calls the Deus abscondus that which is not conceivable by thinking, not he who is not, etc. It is clear that with this postulate of an impersonal basic reality in God, which becomes a person or appears as a person only in the process of creation and revelation, Kabbalism abandons the personalistic basis of the biblical conception of God. In this sense, it is undeniable that the author of the above-mentioned mystical aphorism is right in holding that the Ein Sof, or what is meant by it, is not even mentioned in the Bible and the Talmud. In the following lectures, we shall see how the main schools of Kabbalistic thought have dealt with this problem. It will not surprise us to find that speculation has run the whole gamut, from attempts to retransform the impersonal Ein Sof into personal God of the Bible, to the downright heretical doctrine of a genuine dualism between the hidden Ein Sof and the personal demiurge of Scripture. And demiurge technically is a term for not the real creator, that it works what's already there. Maybe it claims to be God. Shayateen min al jinn, right? For a moment, however, we are more concerned with the second aspect of the Godhead, which, being of decisive importance for real religion, form the main subject of theosophical speculation in Kabbalism. The mystic strives to assure himself of the living presence of God, the God of the Bible, the God who is good, wise, just, and merciful, the embodiment of all other positive attributes, but at the same time he is unwilling to renounce the idea of a hidden God, who remains eternally unknowable in the depths of his own self are, to use the bold expression of the Kabbalist, in the depths of his nothingness. The hidden God may be without special attributes. The living God of whom the revelation speaks, with whom all religion is concerned, must have attributes which, on another plane, represent also the mystic's own scale of moral values. God is good, God is severe, God is merciful and just, etc. As we shall have occasion to see, the mystic does not even recoil before the inference that, in the higher sense, there is a root of evil even in God. The benevolence of God is, to the mystic, not simply the negation of evil, but under a whole sphere of divine light, in which God manifests himself under this particular aspect of benevolence to the contemplation of the Kabbalist. These spheres, which are often described with the aid of mythical metaphors, and provide the key for a kind of mystical topography of the divine realm, are themselves nothing but stages in the revelation of God's creative power. Every attribute represents a given stage, including the attribute of severity and stern judgment, which mystical speculation has connected with the source of evil in God. The mystic who sets out to grasp the meaning of God's absolute unity is thus faced at the outset with an infinite complexity of heavenly spheres and the stages which are described in the Kabbalistic text. From the contemplation of these Sephirot, he proceeds to the conception of God as the union and root of all these contradictions. Generally speaking, the mystics do not seem to conceive of God as absolute being or absolute becoming, but as the union of both, much as the hidden God of whom nothing is known to us and the living God of religious experience and revelation are one and the same. Kabbalism, in other words, is not dualistic, although historically there exists a close connection between its way of thinking and that of the Gnostics, to whom the hidden God and Creator are opposing principles. On the contrary, all the energy of orthodox Kabbalistic speculation is bent to the task of escaping from dualistic consequences. Otherwise, they would not have been able to maintain themselves within the Jewish community. I think it is possible to say that the mystical interpretation of the attributes and the unity of God in the so-called doctrine of the Sephiroth constituted a problem common to all Kabbalists, while the solutions given to it by and in the various schools often differ from one another. In the same way, all Jewish mystics, from Therapeutae, whose doctrine was described by Philo of Alexandria, to the latest Hasid, are at one in giving a mystical interpretation to the Torah. The Torah is to them a living organism animated by a secret life, which streams and pulsates below the crust of its literal meaning. Every one of the innumerable strata of this hidden region corresponds to a new and profound meaning of the Torah. The Torah, in other words, does not consist merely of chapters, phrases, and words. Rather, it is to be regarded as the living incarnation of the divine wisdom which internally sends out new rays of light. It is not merely the historical law of the chosen people, although it is that too. It is rather the cosmic law of the universe as God's wisdom conceived it. Each configuration of letters in it, whether it makes sense in human speech or not, symbolizes some aspect of God's creative power which is active in the universe. And just as the thoughts of God in contrast to those of man are of infinite profundity, so also no single interpretation of the Torah in human language is capable of taking in the whole of its meaning. It cannot be denied that this method of interpretation has proved almost barren for a plain understanding of the Holy Writ, but it is equally undeniable that viewed in this new light, the sacred books made a powerful appeal to the individual who discovered in the written words the secret of his life and of his God. It is the usual fate of sacred writings to become more or less divorced from the intentions of their authors. What may be called their afterlife, those aspects which are discovered by later generations, frequently becomes of greater importance than their original meaning. And after all, who knows what their original meaning was? Part 5. Like all their spiritual kin among Christians or Muslimin, the Jewish mystics cannot, of course, escape from the fact that the relation between mystical contemplation and the basic facts of human life and thought is highly paradoxical. But in the Kabbalah, these paradoxes of the mystical mind frequently assume a peculiar form. Let us take as an instance their relation to the phenomenon of speech. One of the fundamental problems of mystical thought throughout the ages. How is it possible to give lingual expression to mystical knowledge, which by its very nature is related to a sphere where speech and expression are excluded? How is it possible to paraphrase adequately, in mere words, the most intimate act of all, the contact of the individual with the divine, and yet the urge of the mystics is for self-expression? The urge of the mystics for self-expression is well known. They continuously and bitterly complain of the utter inadequacy of words to express their true feelings, but for all that they glory in them. They indulge in rhetoric and never weary of trying to express the inexpressible in words. All writers on mysticism have laid stress on this point. Jewish mysticism is no exception. It is distinguished by two unusual characteristics which may in some way be interrelated. What I have in mind is, first of all, the striking restraint observed by the Kabbalists in referring to the supreme experience, and secondly, their metaphysically positive attitude towards language as God's own instrument. If you compare the writings of Jewish mystics with the mystical literature of other religions, you will notice a considerable difference. A difference which has, to some extent, made difficult and even prevented the understanding of the deeper meaning of Kabbalism. Nothing could be farther from the truth than the assumption that the religious experience of the Kabbalist is barren of that which we as we have seen, forms the essence of mystical experience everywhere and at all times. The ecstatic experience, the encounter with absolute being in the depths of one's own soul, or whatever description one may prefer to give to the goal of the mystical nostalgia, has been shared by the heirs of rabbinical Judaism. How could it be otherwise with one of the original and fundamental impulses of man? At the same time, such differences as there are explained by the existence of an overwhelmingly strong disinclination to treat in express terms of these strictly mystical experiences. Not only is the form different in which these experiences are expressed, but the will to express them and to impart the knowledge of them is lacking or is counteracted by other considerations. It is well known that the autobiographies of great mystics who have tried to give an account of their inner experiences in a direct and personal manner are the glory of mystical literature. These mystical confessions, for all their abounding contradictions, not only provide some of the most important material for the understanding of mysticism, but many of them are also veritable pearls of literature. The Kabbalists, however, are no friends of mystical autobiography. They aim at describing the realm of divinity and the other objects of the contemplation in an impersonal way, by burning, as it were, their ships behind them. They glory in objective description and are deeply averse to letting their own personalities intrude into the picture. Well, it does come through them, whatever their experience and interpretations are. The wealth of expression at their disposal is not inferior to that of their autobiographical confreres. It is as though they were hampered by a sense of shame. Documents of an intimate and personal nature are not entirely lacking, but it is characteristic that they are to be found almost wholly in manuscripts which the Kabbalists themselves would hardly have allowed to be printed. There has even been a kind of voluntary censorship which the Kabbalists themselves exercised by deleting certain passages of a too intimate nature from the manuscripts, or at least by seeing to it that they were not printed. I shall return to this point at a later stage, when I shall give some remarkable instances of this censorship. On the whole, I am inclined to believe that this dislike of a too personal indulgence in self-expression may have been caused by the fact that, among others, that the Jews retained a particularly vivid sense of the incongruity between mystical experience and that idea of God which stresses the aspects of Creator, King, and Lawgiver. It is obvious that the absence of the autobiographical element is a serious obstacle to any psychological understanding of Jewish mysticism, as the psychology of mysticism has to rely primarily on the study of such autobiographical material. In general, it may be said that in the long history of Kabbalism, the number of Kabbalists whose teachings and writings bear the imprint of a strong personality is surprisingly small, one notable exception being the Hasidic movement and its leaders since 1750. This is partially due to the personal reticence which, as we have seen, was characteristic of all Jewish mystics. Equally important, however, is the fact that our sources leave us completely in the dark as regard to the personalities of many Kabbalists, including writers whose influence was very great and whose teachings it would be worthwhile to study in the light of biographical material, were any available. Often enough, such contemporary sources as there are do not even mention their names. Frequently, too, all that these writers have left us are their mystical tracts and books from which it is difficult, if not possible, to form an impression of their personalities. There are very few exceptions to this rule. Among hundreds of Kabbalists whose writings are known to us, hardly 10 would provide sufficient material for biography containing more than a random collection of facts, with little or nothing to give as an insight into their personalities. This is true, for example, of Abraham Abulafia, 13th century, of Isaac Luria, 16th century, and of a much later period of the great mystic and poet Moses Hayim Luzzatto of Padua, died 1747, whose case is typical of the situation I have described. Although his mystical, moralizing, and poetical works fill several volumes, and many of them have been published, The true personality of the author remains so completely in the shadow as to be little more than a name until the discovery and publication by Dr. Simon Ginsberg of his correspondence with his teacher and his friends threw an abundance of light on this remarkable figure. It is to be hoped that the same will gradually be done for other great Jewish mystics, of whom today we know very little. My second point was that Kabbalism is distinguished by an attitude towards language which is quite unusually positive. Kabbalists who differ in almost everything else are at one in regarding language as something more precious than an inadequate instrument for contact between human beings. To them, Hebrew, the holy tongue, which is actually different from Aramea, which is what they call the language of the Tanakh manuscripts, is not simply a means of expressing certain thoughts born out of a certain convention and having purely conventional character. In accordance with the theory of language dominant in the Middle Ages, which is when we have Hebrew, really, language in its purest form, that is Hebrew, according to Kabbalists, reflects the fundamental spiritual nature of the world. In other words, it has a mystical value. Speech reaches God because it comes from God, man's common language, whose prima facie function, indeed, is only of an intellectual nature, reflects the creative language of God. All creation, and this is an important principle of most Kabbalists, is, from the point of view of God, nothing but an expression of his hidden self that begins and ends by giving itself a name, the holy name of God, the perpetual act of creation. All that lives is an expression of God's language. And what is that? Is it that revelation can reveal in the last resort, if not the name of God. I shall have to return to this point at a later stage. What I would like to emphasize is this peculiar interpretation, this enthusiastic appreciation of the faculty of speech, which sees in it and its mystical analysis a key to the deepest secrets of the Creator and his creation. In this connection, it may be of interest to ask ourselves what was the common attitude of the mystics towards certain other faculties and phenomena, such as intellectual knowledge and more particularly rational philosophy, or to take another instance, the problem of individual existence. For after all, mysticism, while beginning with the religion of the individual, proceeds to merge the self into a higher union. Mysticism postulates self-knowledge, to use a Platonic term, as the surest way to God, who reveals himself in the depths of the self. Mystical tendencies, in spite of their strictly personal character, have therefore frequently led to the formation of new social groupings and communities, a fact which is true also in Jewish mysticism. We shall have to return to this fact and to the problem it involves at the end of these lectures. At any rate, Joseph Bernhardt, one of the explorers of the world of mysticism, was justified in saying, "Have any done more to create historical movement than those who seek and proclaim the immovable?" And so, before we start into part 6 here, how many parts there? 6, 8, 9. Let us beware, particularly in this age of social media, to not make our work about our personality. I mean, even if we're a public figure, let's make it about something other than ourselves and what people see of ourselves. I mean, we got to protect our reputation, but yeah, it is precisely this question of history which brings us back to the problem from which we started. What is Jewish mysticism? For now, the question is, what is to be regarded as the general characteristic of mysticism within the framework of Jewish tradition? Kabbalah, it must be remembered, is not the name of a certain dogma or system, but rather the general term applied to a whole religious movement. This movement, with some of whose stages and tendencies we shall have to acquaint ourselves, has been going on from the Talmudic times to the present day. Its development has been uninterrupted, though by no means uniform and often dramatic. It leads from Rabbi Akiba, of whom the Talmud says that he left the paradise of mystical speculation safe and sane as he had entered it, something which cannot indeed be said of every Kabbalist, to the late Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. Is it Kook or Kook? The religious leader of the Jewish community in Palestine, and a splendid type of Jewish mystic. Now, they renamed it Palestine for a reason, because Palestine is the wallowers for the female Satan, is what it means in Aramea, which historically was not the name of the place until the Romans named it the place. And so right before they established, in the decades before they established Israel, they renamed the place to Palestine, but that's for somewhere else. And Gershom Scholem, a lot of his issues that we have of him as an individual center around stuff like that. But I should like to mention here that we are in possession of a vast printed literature of mystical texts, which I am inclined to estimate at 3,000. In addition, there exists an even greater array of manuscripts not yet published. Within this movement, there exists a considerable variety of religious experience. To use William James's expression, there have been many different currents of thought and various systems and forms of speculation. There is little resemblance between the earliest mystical texts in our possession, dating from Talmudic and post-Talmudic days, the writings of the ancient Spanish Kabbalists, those of the school which later flourished in Safed, the holy city of Kabbalism in the 16th century, and finally the Hasidic literature of the modern age. Yet the question must be asked whether there is not something more than a purely historical connection uniting these disjecta membra, something which also provides us with a hint as to what renders this mystical movement in Judaism different from non-Jewish mysticism. Such a common denominator can perhaps be discovered in certain unchanging fundamental ideas concerning God, creation, and the part played by man in the universe. Two such ideas I have mentioned above, namely the attributes of God and the symbolic meaning of the Torah, but may it not also be that such a denominator is to be found in the attitude of the Jewish mystic toward those dominant spiritual forces which have conditioned and shaped the intellectual life of Jewry during the past 2,000 years, the halakha, the Agadah, the prayers, and the philosophy of Judaism, to name the most important. It is this question which I shall now try to answer, though without going into detail. And a lot of these movements exist because of the conservative current in Judaism is about as self-strong as you can say, right? Christianity is more forced, and so as Christendom's fallen left and right, then the hold of a lot of that's fallen. But Judaism kind of worked itself into a more natural sort of conservatism that self-perpetuates a lot better.